So, Christy, the lawyers now representing Mackenzie Shirilla are petitioning a federal court in hopes of getting her conviction thrown out and ordering a new trial. In the petition filed late yesterday, they argue there wasn't enough evidence to move Shirilla's case to adult court when she was under 18 at the time of the crash. They argue excessive speed at the time and where the crash took place is not sufficient evidence under state law to try Shirilla as an adult. The filing also accuses Shirilla's former counsel of not presenting evidence at trial that could have proved her innocence. It says that evidence also gave a reason for Shirilla being in that area at the time. Her new lawyer says a local grocer whose store was near the crash scene left produce for her to pick up at a 24-hour drop spot.
Mackenzie Shirilla has just filed a federal challenge to her murder conviction in the Strongsville case that once dominated national headlines. But to understand why this filing matters, you need to go back to the sentence that helped put her away in the first place. 2 weeks before she killed 2 people, a friend heard her say it out loud during an argument in the middle of an altercation where her boyfriend reportedly grabbed the steering wheel out of her hands. "I will crash this car right now." 2 weeks later, at 5:30 in the morning, she did exactly that, driving her car carrying her boyfriend and their mutual friend into a brick building at 100 miles an hour without ever touching the brakes. Both young men died. She survived. She was 17 years old. A jury convicted her of murder, and a judge warned she could spend the rest of her life in prison. Since then, she has lost appeal after appeal, one rejected simply because it was filed a single day too late, an appeal that contained new medical evidence suggesting she may have blacked out behind the wheel, evidence no court has ever actually heard. Now, with an entirely new legal team, she has taken this fight to federal court, arguing her constitutional rights were violated from the very beginning. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what happened that morning, what her new attorneys say her original trial got wrong, and why this case now sits in the hands of a federal judge. Before we go further, if you are new here, this channel breaks down real documented cases using real sources. No speculation dressed up as fact. Subscribe to True Crime Revealed so you do not miss where this case goes next. Let us start from the beginning, because this case has always lived in a difficult space between two competing narratives, a devastating accident and a deliberate act of violence, and understanding both sides is essential before we get into the legal fight happening right now. Mackenzie Shirilla grew up in Strongsville, Ohio, a suburb southwest of Cleveland. At 17 years old, she was in a relationship with Dominic Russo, who was 20. According to prosecutors and family members who spoke publicly around the time of her trial, that relationship had grown increasingly volatile in the weeks and months leading up to the crash that would end 2 lives. Prosecutors described it, in their own words, as a toxic relationship, one marked by conflict, jealousy, and escalating tension between Shirilla and Russo. On July 17, 2022, roughly 2 weeks before the fatal crash, Shirilla and Russo got into an argument. According to accounts presented at trial, this was not simply a verbal disagreement. At some point during that altercation, Russo reportedly grabbed the steering wheel of the car Shirilla was driving, a detail prosecutors would later point to as an example of the kind of volatile, erratic driving dynamic that existed between them. It was during this same altercation, according to a friend who claims to have overheard the exchange, that Shirilla said something that would go on to carry enormous weight in her eventual trial. "I will crash this car right now." 4 words, said in the heat of an argument, 2 weeks before they would become horrifyingly literal. Then came July 31st, 2022. In the early morning hours, around 5:30, Shirilla was driving Russo and their mutual friend, 19-year-old Davion Flanagan, from Russo's home toward a friend's house. The route took them through a business park in Strongsville, along a road that prosecutors would later emphasize dead-ended directly into a building. According to the evidence presented at trial, Shirilla accelerated the vehicle to approximately 100 miles per hour and never applied the brakes before crashing directly into the Plidco building, a brick structure in that business park. The impact killed both Russo and Flanagan. Shirilla survived. From the very beginning, this case turned on a single, enormously consequential question. Was this a tragic accident, caused by a 17-year-old driver losing control of her vehicle at an extremely dangerous speed, or was it something else entirely, a deliberate act, carried out in the aftermath of a deteriorating, troubled relationship? Prosecutors argued forcefully for the latter, They pointed to the statement Shirilla had allegedly made 2 weeks earlier, to the documented volatility of her relationship with Russo, and to the simple physical facts of the crash itself: extremely high speed, a straight road, and no evidence that she ever attempted to brake or slow down before impact. To prosecutors, this combination painted a picture not of a driver who lost control, but of someone who made a deliberate choice. In August of 2023, a jury agreed with that theory. Shirilla was found guilty on 12 separate counts, including 4 counts of murder, along with felonious assault, aggravated vehicular homicide, and additional related charges. She cried as the verdicts were read, according to reporting from the time. Because she was 17 at the time of the crash, her case had first required a transfer from juvenile court into the adult criminal justice system, a transfer that would later become one of the central pillars of her legal team's ongoing challenge to this entire conviction. Shirilla was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison, currently serving that sentence at the Ohio Reformatory for Women in Marysville. Under the terms of her sentence, she will not become eligible for parole until 2037, when she will be 33 years old. At sentencing, the trial judge delivered a warning that has followed this case ever since, telling Shirilla directly that she could, depending on how future parole hearings unfold, spend the remainder of her entire life behind bars. This case would go on to attract significant national attention, eventually becoming the subject of a Netflix documentary titled The Crash, a title that reflects just how much public fascination this specific combination of youth, tragedy, and disputed intent generated. For years following her conviction, Shirilla's legal team pursued a series of appeals, and each of them, up until this point, has failed. It is worth walking through this history carefully, because the pattern of these failures directly explains why her current legal team has now taken this fight to an entirely different court system altogether. One earlier post-conviction petition raised claims of ineffective assistance of counsel, alongside something genuinely significant: new medical evidence suggesting Shirilla may have blacked out during the crash itself. Think about what that claim actually implies, if true. A driver who loses consciousness behind the wheel is not making a deliberate choice to crash. She is experiencing a medical event entirely outside her control. If that evidence had been properly presented and seriously considered, it could have fundamentally changed how a jury, or an appellate court, understood what actually happened in those final seconds before impact. But that evidence was never actually evaluated on its merits. According to court records, that particular petition was filed 1 day past its required deadline. As a direct result, a lower court barred the petition from being considered at all, not because the underlying medical claims were weighed and rejected, but because of a single day's delay in filing. Shirilla's team subsequently appealed that procedural rejection to the Ohio Supreme Court, asking the state's highest court to hear the case despite the missed deadline. In June of this year, the Ohio Supreme Court declined to hear that appeal, leaving the lower court's procedural ruling fully intact. That means, as of this recording, potentially exculpatory medical evidence, evidence that could theoretically explain the crash as a medical event rather than a deliberate act, has never once been substantively reviewed by any court, at any level, because of a missed filing deadline that has nothing to do with the evidence itself. Separately, Shirilla's team also pursued an appeal to Ohio's 8th District Court of Appeals, specifically asking that court to reopen her direct appeal on the grounds of ineffective assistance of counsel. That effort, too, did not succeed in overturning her conviction. Which brings us to the newest, and by far the most significant, development in this case. On Tuesday, July 28, 2026, an entirely new legal team representing Shirilla filed a petition in the United States District Court for the Northern District of Ohio, specifically seeking what is known as a writ of habeas corpus. This case has now been assigned to Federal Judge John Adams, and as of this recording, no court dates have yet been scheduled. Before we go through what this new filing actually argues, it is worth taking a moment to explain plainly what a writ of habeas corpus actually is, because this legal mechanism plays a crucial role in the American justice system, and understanding it helps clarify exactly what Shirilla's legal team is now asking a federal court to do. The term itself comes from Latin, meaning, roughly, "you have the body." In practical terms, a writ of habeas corpus is a legal order that forces the authorities holding someone in custody to justify that continued confinement in front of a court. When state prisoners believe their state-level prosecution violated their federally protected constitutional rights in some way, they can petition a federal court specifically to review that claim. This is an important distinction. Habeas corpus petitions are not simply another round of state-level appeals. They represent an entirely separate avenue, moving a case out of the state court system that has already ruled against a defendant multiple times and placing it directly in front of a federal judge who will evaluate the case specifically through the lens of the United States Constitution. Shirilla's new legal team, from the Cleveland-based firm Marein Bradley, replacing her original trial attorneys from Friedman, Nemechek, Long, and Grant, has built this federal petition around several distinct constitutional claims, and each one deserves careful, individual explanation. The first major argument concerns the transfer of her case from juvenile court into the adult criminal justice system. Because Shirilla was only 17 at the time of the crash, her case would ordinarily have remained under the jurisdiction of the juvenile court system, which operates under different standards, different sentencing structures, and a fundamentally different philosophy than the adult system, one generally more oriented toward rehabilitation than punishment. In order to try her as an adult on murder and felonious assault charges, prosecutors were required to demonstrate that a specific legal standard had been met, that she acted, in the language of the law, purposely or knowingly. Her new attorneys now argue there was insufficient evidence to meet that specific threshold, meaning, in their view, the entire transfer of her case into adult court may have been improper from the very start. If a federal court were to agree with this argument, it would represent an extraordinarily significant ruling, essentially suggesting that everything which followed, the adult trial, the murder convictions, the sentence itself, was built on a foundational transfer that should never have happened in the first place. The second major argument extends that same core legal standard directly into the trial itself, arguing there was insufficient evidence presented to establish, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Shirilla acted purposely or knowingly when she crashed the vehicle. This is, in some ways, the central legal battleground of this entire case, and has been from the beginning. Prosecutors built their case around behavioral evidence, an alleged prior statement, a documented pattern of relationship conflict, and the physical circumstances of the crash itself, extreme speed with no apparent braking. Shirilla's defense now argues that this circumstantial picture, however troubling it may appear on the surface, does not actually rise to the specific legal standard required to prove intentional murder, as opposed to a reckless or even simply tragic accident. The third argument involves ineffective assistance of counsel, a claim that her original trial attorneys failed to adequately represent her interests during the actual trial itself. Specifically, her new attorneys point to a piece of evidence they say was never properly introduced, proof that Russo himself had grabbed the steering wheel during that earlier altercation 2 weeks before the crash. Remember, prosecutors used that same earlier incident as evidence of Shirilla's own volatile, threatening driving behavior, specifically citing her alleged statement about crashing the car. Her new legal team argues this framing left out crucial context, that Russo's own physical interference with the vehicle during that same altercation was never fully presented to the jury, information that could have reshaped how jurors understood the entire dynamic between the two of them, not simply as one person threatening dangerous behavior, but as a genuinely volatile situation involving both parties. Additional claims raised in this new federal filing include allegations of improper admission of certain evidence during the original trial, along with broader due process violations, and a claim that her right to properly confront witnesses against her, a specific constitutional protection under the Sixth Amendment, was violated during the proceedings that led to her conviction. It is essential, at this point, to be clear and honest about exactly what this filing represents, and what it does not represent. This is not new evidence proving Shirilla's innocence. This is a formal legal argument, presented by her attorneys, that her constitutional rights were violated during the process that led to her conviction and continued imprisonment. A federal judge will now have to evaluate each of these specific claims, the juvenile transfer standard, the sufficiency of evidence for intent, the ineffective assistance of counsel claims, and the additional due process and confrontation clause arguments on their individual legal merits. This process can take a significant amount of time, and as of this recording, no hearing dates have even been scheduled yet. It is also worth being fair and balanced about the strength of the case that led to her original conviction in the first place. A jury heard the evidence prosecutors presented, the alleged statement made 2 weeks before the crash, the documented relationship conflict, and the physical facts of a car accelerating to 100 miles per hour on a dead-end road without ever braking. And that jury unanimously found Shirilla guilty on 12 separate counts, including 4 separate murder charges. That is not a verdict reached lightly. and it reflects a considered judgment by 12 ordinary citizens who sat through the entirety of the evidence presented at trial. A federal habeas petition, even one raising legitimate constitutional questions, faces a genuinely difficult legal standard to overcome, precisely because our justice system places enormous weight on the finality of jury verdicts, and federal courts do not lightly overturn state convictions simply because a defendant's new legal team believes the original trial could have gone differently. At the same time, the specific procedural history of this case does raise real, legitimate questions worth taking seriously. Potentially significant medical evidence suggesting Shirilla may have lost consciousness during the crash itself, was never substantively reviewed by any court, at any level, purely because of a single missed filing deadline. Whatever ultimately happens with this new federal petition, that specific fact remains true, and it represents exactly the kind of procedural gap that the habeas corpus process exists to potentially address, a mechanism specifically designed to catch situations where a defendant's underlying constitutional claims may never have received the substantive review they deserved through the ordinary state appeals process. It is also worth remembering, throughout all of this legal complexity, exactly what is actually at the center of this case: two young men who lost their lives in the early morning hours of July 31st, 2022. Dominic Russo was 20 years old. Davion Flanagan was 19. Their families have already sat through an entire trial, a sentencing hearing, and multiple subsequent appeals, each time being asked to relive the circumstances of that morning, and each time watching as the legal system continued grappling with exactly how to classify what happened: a deliberate, murderous act, or an unimaginably tragic accident involving a teenager behind the wheel of a car traveling far too fast on a road that gave her no room for error. Whatever a federal court ultimately decides about the constitutional questions Shirilla's new attorneys have raised, that underlying loss, two young lives ended far too soon, remains the unchangeable, permanent center of this entire story. So, where does this leave us right now? Mackenzie Shirilla remains incarcerated at the Ohio Reformatory for Women, serving her original sentence of 15 years to life, with parole eligibility not arriving until 2037. Her murder conviction, along with the other 11 counts a jury found her guilty of in 2023, remains fully intact and legally binding as of this recording. What has changed is that, for the first time, her case has moved out of the Ohio state court system entirely and into the hands of a federal judge, who must now evaluate a detailed set of constitutional claims involving her juvenile to adult transfer, the sufficiency of evidence used to prove intent, ineffective assistance of counsel at her original trial, and broader due process and confrontation clause violations. This is a genuinely different legal landscape than anything her case has faced before, a fresh set of eyes, operating under a fresh legal framework, examining a case that has already been reviewed and upheld multiple times at the state level. We will continue following this case as Judge Adams and the federal court system work through this newly filed petition, as any scheduling or hearing dates are eventually announced, and as this legal battle, now genuinely uncertain in its outcome, continues to unfold. We will bring you those developments the moment they are verified, and not before. That is everything we have for you on this update. If you want to understand exactly how this federal habeas process plays out for Mackenzie Shirilla, make sure you are subscribed to True Crime Revealed so you do not miss what comes next. Drop a like if this breakdown helped you understand the legal complexity behind this case, and let us know in the comments whether you think this new federal petition has a real chance of succeeding, or whether you believe the original conviction should stand. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next update.